Well, this is their building.
Black, Blackstone, Blackwater, Black Rock, Black.
I'll say Blackwater.
It might be. Is it Blackwater?
No, couldn't be Blackwater. I mean, Kirkland else.
It is a. It's a brand new building. So. Well.
Good morning, everybody. My name's Liesl Fuchs, and I serve as the SVP for Academic Affairs and Provost at the University of Arizona, and it's a great delight to welcome everybody here this morning. Thank you for coming out in the rain, especially, to join us in person, and thanks also to those that are joining us online. It's my great pleasure to introduce our Places and Spaces, Fostering the Future of the Arts dialogue this morning. And we've got a fabulous panel discussion prepared, and I hope you enjoy it as much as we've intended. The arts, of course, entertain us and they inspire us and they bring about change. And we know that we always have to struggle to keep the arts relevant to people as our demographics and tastes change and emerge in different directions. And of course, now technology is also changing the direction of the arts, and artists are increasingly looking for new models of presentation and engagement. This morning, our panel is going to explore how we're going to think about the future of cultural spaces and how the arts can transport organizations and communities towards the future that they envisage for themselves. I'm delighted to welcome our three guests, Ruby Lopez Harper from Americans for the Arts. Thank you for joining us, Ruby. Michael Orlove from the National Endowment for the Arts. Michael, lovely to have you here with us. And our own Chad Herzog from Arizona Arts. And I also want to introduce Andy Schulz, the Dean of the College of Fine Arts, but also the inaugural Vice President for the Arts at the university. The university created a new division called Arizona Arts only in 2019 to provide a unified gateway to the unique visual and performing art assets that we have at the University of Arizona. And we are so pleased that Andy is leading that effort. Already in a few short years, we've dramatically changed the way that we talk about the arts on campus and the way we ensure that the arts are integral to really everything we do. And so with that, I don't want to take up any more time. I'm going to hand over to you, Andy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Liesl, for that introduction. And just to echo the thanks to all of you for coming out this morning, braving the rain. Those of you online, great to have you here as well. Yeah, I'm delighted to be moderating our panel this morning. And I'll just mention a little bit about a framing context which Liesl started to provide in relationship to our ambitions for the arts at the U of A, specifically the Arts Initiative that's part of our strategic plan, which seeks to elevate and integrate the arts into all aspects of the university, particularly with regards to students and ensuring that all students have the opportunity for meaningful experiences in the arts that they see as formative to their time at the university. And secondly, in relation to the university's outward-facing public university land-grant mission. I'll also say by way of introduction that we're deeply informed by our location and by our sense of place and what it means to be in the borderlands and in the region we're in. And so that's an important part of how we're thinking about the work we do as well. So over the next hour or so, I think we actually have an hour and a half for the panel, and we'll, of course, open it up for conversation and dialogue after we start with some questions for the panelists. But what I'd like to do is really place that ambitious vision within a broader context of developments, trends, shifts that have been going on and in some ways been accelerated in the arts more broadly. And so to do that, I'm joined by a remarkable panel of leading figures in the field of arts advocacy, leadership, and programming, each of whom brings what I would describe as a lifetime of experience and expertise to the topic we're talking about. And I'm going to give fairly full introductions just to give you a sense of just how rich the experiences of these individuals are and some of the topics and issues we might talk about, and maybe those introductions will also trigger for you some questions and thoughts about topics we might talk about. So beginning to my immediate right is Ruby Lopez Harper, the Vice President, Equity and Local Arts Engagement for Americans for the Arts. Ruby's wide-ranging portfolio at Americans for the Arts includes external equity strategies, as well as field education, leadership development, local arts advancement, and cohort building for the local arts agency field, for arts and culture administrators, and for arts marketers. She's the chief architect of the National Arts Marketing Project Conference. In 2019, she was selected by our good friends up I-10 at ASU as a Practices for Change Fellow. And that same year, she was recognized as an inspirational woman for her works as an arts advocate by the And I Thought Women in Literature. She's a steering committee member for the National Coalition for Arts Preparedness and Emergency Response, and that's particularly interesting. I want to hear more about that as we talk, and serves in a number of other capacities for the arts sector. Her work focuses on equitable access, on grant making, supporting individual artists, community development, economic development, cultural tourism, marketing, and also public art. And she draws on a very wide-ranging background that includes corporate affairs, community relations, volunteerism, employee engagement, and marketing communication, among many other things. So, Ruby, it's great to have you with us. Welcome.
Thank you.
Next to Ruby is Michael Orlov. Michael, thank you for joining us. Michael serves as the Director of State, Regional, and Local Partnerships for the National Endowment for the Arts here in Washington, D.C. And in that capacity, Michael provides direction concerning NEA funding and other assistance to the 56 state and jurisdictional arts agencies, the 6 regional agencies, and as well as local agencies across the country. Additionally, Michael manages the agency's international activities. And before assuming his current role, he was the NEA's Director of Artist Communities and Presenting in Multidisciplinary Works for about 7 years. Michael's a native of Chicago and spent almost 2 decades really influencing and shaping culture in Chicago as senior program director for the Chicago Department of Cultural Affairs. During that time, Michael helped to transform the Chicago Cultural Center into a prime downtown performing arts venue, and he launched several really long-standing and influential programs, Chicago Summer Dance, as well as World Music Festival Chicago. And Michael also played a key role in launching and overseeing music programming in Millennium Park, which occupies such an important place in downtown Chicago. Michael's received a number of honors for his work, including he's been a Chicagoan of the Year in music by the Chicago Tribune on 2 occasions. He's been one of Chicago's global visionaries, as recognized by WBEZ, and received a number of international honors as well. So Michael, thank you for joining us. And finally, our own Chad Herzog, known to, I think, many people in this room for the work he's done in the 2 short years he's been at the university. I think Chad has had a really remarkable impact, both in the arts and also more recently during the COVID-19 pandemic. Chad has stepped in and played a really central role in thinking about that work broadly and the role the arts can play as well. So Chad joined U of A in 2019 as executive director of UA Presents, and since then he has transformed that organization into something completely new and inspiring, which we're now calling Arizona Arts Live, which is has as its mission curating live experiences that inspire creativity, that enrich the culture of Southern Arizona, and that take Tucson and U of A to the global stage. Chad oversees all aspects of the organization, from strategy to engagement, provides creative vision and curating our season both on and off campus. And I think the extension of Arizona Arts Live into the community has been one of the really interesting, broadly into Tucson has been one of the really interesting developments. Before coming to the U of A, Chad was the artistic director and also co-director of the Festival for Arts and Ideas, International Festival for Arts and Ideas in New Haven, where he oversaw the artistic vision of the festival as well as many other aspects. Before that, Chad served as director of performing arts at Juniata College in Huntington, Pennsylvania, and Chad and I spent a number of years unknowingly an hour apart from each other. As well as actually in State College. Chad had an amazingly wide range of roles at Juniata. He oversaw the music and theater departments. He taught and advised students, served as the primary fundraiser for visual and performing arts, which led to the design and construction of a new arts center. And during his tenure, arts participation at Juniata rose by 600%, and we're hoping for a similar rise here at the U of A. That's a benchmark to try to achieve. That's a pretty amazing transformation. Not sure what it was when he got there, but when he left, it was pretty impressive.
It's a lot like it is at U of A right now. So
Chad, thank you also for joining us. I thought I'd start with a couple of really broad questions, just to kind of get a bunch of ideas on the table, and we'll dive deeper into the work that all of these people do and the organizations they're part of and the experiences they've had. But what I thought I would do, and any of you can jump in to answer this. I won't direct it at anyone in particular to start with. But how would you answer the question, why do the arts matter? And I'm not gonna frame that any further away. There are a lot of dimensions to thinking about that. But President Robbins came up to you in the elevator on the way down and said, "Why do the arts matter?" What's your elevator pitch?
I'm like, I need
I know,
more
it's 8 a.m.
coffee. Okay, so
Are you gonna
go
go first?
Yeah, I'll go first.
Thank you, Ruby.
I know, right?
That's why I'm not putting any of you on the spot. I'll let you. And
Okay.
I invite all of you to think about it too. I mean, it's an interesting question to reflect on in so many ways.
Well, and I think it's also like, which aspect, right? I mean, they tell you, have your elevator pitch ready for anybody that you might run into and knowing who you're talking to, right? So what context are we asking? My personal view, the arts matter because that is our soul. That is what we are as people. That is how we connect to one another. That's how we experience life. That's how we express our feelings and our dreams and our, imagination. But, if you want a more practical, why do the arts matter? The arts matter because they are the foundation of community. They drive economics, they drive cohesion, they drive pride, they drive solution, innovation, imagination. How can they not matter?
Thank you.
What
Thank
Ruby
you,
said.
Ruby.
Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you for this invitation. And I'm also stalling while I can get my ideas together. No, really, thank you to the university. And the building is beautiful and the space is great. So we appreciate the invitation. What Ruby said, I mean, I agree with everything. And I'm going to draw maybe from somebody that I know both Ruby and I look up to a lot, Roberto Bedoya, who always talks about belonging.
Mm-hmm.
And that really resonated with me when I first met Roberto, because my initial mentor, Lois Weisberg, who was the Commissioner of Cultural Affairs for many years in Chicago, her whole vision for the Cultural Center, for Millennium Park, for everything we did was belonging. Mm-hmm. And she talked about belonging, and she felt that the arts were the greatest vehicle to just bring people together. Mm-hmm. All of the events that we did, no surprise, were free to the public, which was another part of her, real passions, was that access is also, important. And I could draw upon stories that kind of address why arts matter, but
we'll come back to some of those maybe as we go along.
But I'll just say this, from my earliest days of programming with the city up until now, when you get to see it through a different lens with grant making, the arts really do provide this incredible vehicle, whether you're in Tucson, whether in Chicago, whether in Washington, D.C., that bring people together, that make people feel like they belong. And that's, for me, would be part of the elevator pitch, although Ruby's was hit many more different.
I answered the question.
Yeah, you answered the question. I think we'll come back again and again in the course of our discussion to this idea of community belonging. It's certainly deeply ingrained in the work all three of you have done over the past several decades. Chad, what would you add to this, just as a part of
and adding just how much we've been reminded over the last 20 months on how much the arts matter in a time where we have struggled to come together or have been permitted from coming close together at a time where there's nothing more that I want than to feel all of your breath at a concert or your heart's beat next to mine. That's why the arts matter.
Yeah. Well, the experience we had the other night of many of us of watching the film we screened here and being in the same room with others and watching a film like Missing in Brooks County about migrant deaths. I mean, that's a different experience than the individual experience of seeing it in our own spaces. So I felt that just the other night, actually.
But I think even in that, and we'll probably get more into this later, is that this moment, this time has pushed us to redefine how we connect and to be open and both on both sides, right? We have to think about not just how we're experiencing, but how we're designing those experiences. So when you were, I think it was Lisa that mentioned earlier that, artists are looking for new ways to produce or to interact or to deliver. Audiences are looking for new ways to experience. Yeah. Right. And so I know for me, kind of on the other side of that, like when you said feeling people's breath, I was like, panic attack. Anxiety. Oh, I can't do this. But yeah, that's the thing. But so I have been following a musician, Tracy Bonham. She's a 90s indie, amazing female musician. And I rarely have gotten to see her live because I grew up on the West Coast. She's out here. And certainly never could take my kids to go see her because she doesn't perform in those kind of venues. But over this time, we've been able to see her in concert twice. And my kids are singing along and we're sitting in the comfort of my living room and I don't feel any different.
Interesting.
I'm sucked in and drawn in and I'm experiencing this in a different way and watching my kids experience it in a different way. The access that we've been granted And I look at it as a gift. I don't see this time. I mean, yes, we're all experiencing, it's very oppressive, it's horrible, but there's also a gift in this. And an exploration, an opportunity, and a push to do different. Because now we don't have any other option. So I think it's really interesting on all sides.
You're absolutely right. And this leads into the second broad question I was going to ask to kind of start to frame the discussion. Then we'll maybe dive in a little bit more to the work that you're doing in particular to kind of open some other ideas up. But I was going to ask, about the role of the arts and artists in this moment, and how have things changed over the past 18 months in light of not only the pandemic, but also the increased focus on social and racial justice. You're starting to answer one aspect of this in terms of production and consumption, of art. But what are some other things you would point to in terms of what's shifted over in this period that we can put on the table and we can come back to and unpack over the course of our conversation?
So much has shifted over the past. I think it's more than 18 months. For some reason, we keep saying 18 months, but it's well, if we're talking about just the pandemic, but it's kind of what we talked about last week when we were on the phone. I mean, there's been these fissures, these cracks in the system for decades now that have just completely come apart, and it's kind of what we talked about just a minute ago. The systems that have been in place for a long time clearly aren't working. And we're talking about equity, we're talking about social justice, we're talking about all kinds of systems that have been set up to keep folks down, keep folks out. And that's just all kind of been in a perfect storm. Maybe perfect storm isn't the right word or phrase, but that's just all unraveled now. I was, as Ruby was saying about watching Tracy Bonham with her kids. I don't know Tracy Bonham, so I'm gonna have to look it up.
She's amazing.
It made really me think about what we've learned. It's almost like a giant mirror has been put up. If we're talking about the art sector, a giant mirror has been put up in front of all of us. And some are like, I knew that was, I know that image, and others were really surprised, really shocked. And I feel like there's a ton of learning and also figuring out a new path forward. I don't know in terms of futuring what the performing arts world, what the venue world is going to look like, but it's going to be different. And there's a lot of reckoning and understanding that we're going to have to figure out as arts colleagues, leaders, professionals. Anyways, I'll pause there.
Lots to go back to and really interesting.
I'll pause there.
Chad, I know you've been living this, Chad, in your own way as leader of Arizona Arts Live and creating a new organization in the midst of what's been happening. What are your thoughts on what's the current moment, if you will?
One of the things that we're very lucky is the democratization that technology has done and bringing concerts to our living rooms. And for many of those concerts, they're free. We've been asked to support artists. That's been good. I think the way that we have flipped the ecosystem of how artists are making money is a challenge that we're going to be faced with, especially when we're watching and consuming so much online. And so that's a concern of mine. But the fact that artists are able to make and create and still provide a sense of, dare we call it normalcy, for us as we're in our living rooms, looking at our tablets or our television screens or laptops, being able to experience this. I'll be honest, I'm personally very tired of it. As somebody who is consuming less live performance today, live being streamed to me, than I have in the last 20 years of my life, because I'm so tired of the screen time, which is, it's something I wasn't personally thinking I would get to. But when I look at what a year would have looked like for me 2 years ago, where I would have been out seeing 300 plus performances a year, not counting the little pop-up things that happen and just the happenings around us. I miss being able to get out and see that. So while I've had access to amazing content, and some of it, fortunately, very fresh, unfortunately, a lot of it regurgitated from years past, I'm struggling right now with how it's going. The fact, though, that we've been able to get out and share our work, Andy mentioned rebranding during a pandemic, and I can thank our friends that are here today from Brink for helping us do that. But also that we were able to introduce all of you to neighbors of yours in Southern Arizona that you didn't know were live performers. People who spent their life out on the road, who suddenly had their bag sitting in a corner for who knows how long. And you were able to get to know them as people who make incredible music or live performance. That was really special to us as the time that we're doing this. And you came out and you supported them by opening your digital wallet and cash apping them or Venmoing them to share your support. That's been good, but I'm tired of the screen.
Yeah.
And
So, two things on that. One, the role of the arts isn't to fix everything. So that's something that I feel really strongly about, is that we talk a lot about but the arts shouldn't be expected to be the only thing that fixes it, right? To your point, there are systems that have never worked.
Mm-hmm.
It's cool that everybody's realizing that now, but some people that's been their reality, or some people that's been the thing that we've been fighting against. And the arts aren't going to fix it by itself. Everything has to come together. The arts are part of a community, and that community has to make a decision on what it values and how it's going to incorporate the arts into the solution process, right? The arts bring people together. So what does that mean when we're thinking about fixing systemic inequity? Is the arts going to fix it by itself? No. So I think for me, the role of the arts is that it's not our job to fix everything.
although they're always called to. But
But that's what I'm saying,
Yeah.
right? Like
For free.
And that's what I'm saying,
Yeah.
right? So the other thing that I wanted to say, to your point, the thing that resonated for me was regurgitated content, right? We've been looking at this moment for an extended period of time as a moment. This is our new reality. This is where we are. And so to look at digital content like a Band-Aid or a bridge, I think is no longer going to serve us in terms of fresh, in terms of drawing and retaining audiences. A lot of organizations saw new audience engagement in the digital environment. Now it's our job to equip those organizations and make sure that they have access to resources so that they can improve the quality of their digital experiences, because this is a reality now. And for me, it's also about making sure that we're monetizing. We've asked and expected artists and arts organizations to give their content away for free. It's going to be that much harder for them to say, but this has value, when we have propagated and upheld the idea that this is free. It's not free. It costs money. It breaks my heart when artists are like, donate. No, don't donate. Pay. I'm going to start cursing.
Yeah. It's
You're allowed. You're allowed, Ruby.
That was coming. I caught it.
it's
Your product has value. Your output has value. You have value, and that value costs something. And we need to stop pretending that it's free. It's not. And I think those are the two things that I'm like, no.
Yeah.
and it's also not a sustainable model. I mean, for everything that you did, which I participated in some of it, which was amazing. The fact of the matter is, it's the University of Arizona that's setting that up, and you have the tools to do it. You have the means to do it. But around the country, so many folks, as Ruby was saying, don't have the tools in place to set up,
To not just make, but to consume. And I think that's the other part we have to look
consumption,
at.
on
right?
both sides.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And it's I think a lot of people who are not working within our sphere are like, oh, this is great. Artists are sharing their stuff online and they're getting paid. I mean, come on. It's not a lucrative model.
Right. Right.
But I also, to Chad's earlier point about missing the heartbeats and breathing, I also I've been to a couple shows here in DC, but I had there's a installation, an art installation out at the Washington Monument, which I think the Washington Monument somewhere
right
there.
here.
I think we can see it. It's Susan Furstenberg's installation called American Remembrance, and it's stunning and sobering and shocking, but it's basically flags have been placed to represent every life lost to COVID, 675,000 or more, and you can look at it online. And so I looked at it online, and you could get the sense of it. But then I took my family there on Saturday night, and it's a totally different experience. It was such an emotional experience to be sharing it with other people, and the two. I'm not sold on. I've heard people say we're sold on the hybrid model. We're gonna be doing digital forever. And part of it makes sense, and then part of it's just like it's not the same. Anyways, I brought that up just as an example that's been sitting with me. And I also encourage everybody that's here,
Many people
when
have
it's
been
not
over there.
pouring rain,
Yeah.
or even when it is, you should go out and see it. It's a really extraordinary.
Sobering is the right word, actually. Saw it
Yeah.
the other day. Yeah. So let's. Wow, so many interesting things percolating as we knew would be the case in this conversation when we talked on the phone and to get ready a little bit. But I'd like to shift the focus a little bit to the work that you're each doing and the organizations that you're part of, which people, Ruby, in your case, I'm not sure everyone in this room will be familiar with Americans for the Arts. So maybe you could talk a little bit about the mission of Americans for the Arts, the work you do, and maybe your own journey to where you are now, because I also think each of you has a really amazingly interesting trajectory, which I think is typical often in the arts and arts administration. It's not a linear path where you start in one place and that there's a straight line trajectory to where you end up. So maybe you could talk about the organization as well as your own professional work.
Sure. So Americans for the Arts is the national service organization for the arts, which is giant. It is as giant as it sounds. We provide advocacy, we do legislation support, policy making, research, field education. We have a number of leadership development programs. The area that I specifically focus in is equity and local arts engagement. I work with 4,500 local arts agencies around the country in order to support them doing their best work in service to their community. I also work internally in terms of unifying our external equity strategies to make sure that everyone that's doing anything external facing understands and is aligned with the equity commitments that the organization has made. And so sometimes that requires organizing internal training. So we have a really great training coming up with Art Changes called Beyond Solidarity, and it's around community benefit principles. So how do we show up as better partners in the communities that we're working in because we're a national organization? That's kind of the really tight.
How did you get there?
Crazy.
How did you get to where you currently are?
So I grew up in. What's really interesting is I came to the nonprofit work by way of corporate. So my first blush at kind of nonprofit interaction, I was working for Limited Brands, which is the parent company for Victoria's Secret, Express, Limited, Abercrombie and Fitch. They're this very international fashion retail. I was in corporate affairs, started working in media relations, moved to investor relations, and then moved to community relations, where I was doing employee engagement programs, specifically around breast cancer awareness. I started working frontline for the corporate foundation, so every request that was coming came into my desk. So I would process anywhere from 100, I think when I was analyzing it was 125 to 375 a week requests that were coming into the foundation, whether it was in-kind support, product donation, or funds. And that was kind of where it started. I went from there to the Greater Columbus Arts Council. And I worked there for 9 years, stewarding their grant program. So I organized support for individual artists, professional development programs, and then organizational grant programs as well. From there, during there, I started volunteering with Americans for the Arts. I was encouraged and supported. So I think one thing I want to plug is make sure that you support folks around you, folks that are new and coming up into the field. Because if it wasn't for my boss saying, no, you really need to do this, I think it would be great for you. And me going, fine. I would never have the job that I have now. I don't have a degree, which usually makes audiences that I'm talking to that do have them a little uncomfortable. Because I think I'm kind of one of the last of the late great maybe generation that came into the workforce and came into senior leadership from a completely different path. And kind of everything that means with it as well. And so I started volunteering. I was elected to the Emerging Leaders Council, which was an advisory body for Americans for the Arts for their emerging leader programming, part of their leadership development work that they were doing. I have a wonderful colleague in the room that I care for still very deeply, and I'm so excited. So lifeline connections that happen because of these kinds of things. But ultimately, at some point, they were like, hey, we have this job and we think you'd be great. And I'm like, I don't want to move to DC. But I applied because these kinds of jobs sometimes feel like they're once in a lifetime. So you can't not go. And I was very fortunate to be hired. And, the rest is kind of history. I've been there, going to close my 6th year at the end of this year. I started as the director of local arts advancement. I'm now the vice president of equity and local arts engagement. I think it's been a really roller coaster ride. And I'm just so excited about the future of the work, the future of the field. This has been a crazy time. And I think one thing that we didn't touch on, the disaster work, has really kind of toppled everything that we've been doing. But because of that, I've learned a lot more than I think I would have about the gaps in the infrastructure, the gaps in our collective knowledge of what is happening, what is needed, who has access to resources, who has knowledge, who has, all of these things have really amplified. And I think had it not been for the disaster work that's an element of the portfolio, I don't know that I would have aligned or matched up the dots in the same way.
Interesting. Yeah. Michael, how about you? Can you tell us more about NEA, about the work you're doing there, about interesting transition you made from being a programmer to being a grant maker, and working that sort of shift in your professional life?
Sure. Well, I always say the National Endowment for the Arts because when I moved here now 9 years ago this month, there's another NEA in town. And many, you realize, I've been at cocktail parties and they're like, so how did you get into education? I was like, oh, okay, right. Not the National Education Association. So sometimes it's frustrating. People are like, yes, I know you work at the National Endowment for the Arts, but it's important to keep saying it because there are 2 NEAs.
Okay.
So I came, as you said earlier, to start initially as the director of presenting in multidisciplinary works and artist communities, which was really more from the field I came from, and I'll talk about that in a second. But a couple of years ago, I got a promotion within the agency to run the partnership portfolio, which is state, regional, local partnerships, the National Endowment for the Arts for decades. By congressional law, 40% of our budget, which thankfully is going up. Americans for the Arts plays a wonderful role in making sure that the dial is going this way and not that way. So 40% of our budget goes to the state arts agencies and the 6 regional arts organizations. It's a system that was set up a long time ago. So I manage that portion of our agency along with the local arts agency portfolio, which is where Ruby and I really get to spend time with monthly calls that Americans for the Arts sets up. And this is where, if I was doing a grants workshop, I would lay a $5 bill on the table and say, anybody that can tell me the 6 territories gets the $5, because very few people can actually guess the 6 territories of the United States. Michelle, you can't play in this game because you know it by heart. Everybody else, I'll just say it because we don't have time to go through it. But American Samoa, Guam, Northern Mariana Islands, Puerto Rico, and can anybody tell me the 6th one or the 5th one? Samantha knows. Washington, D.C. Nobody gets Washington, D.C. and the U.S. Virgin Islands. So that's my little trick. You guys can all use it now. So it's been a fascinating relationship building experience to work hand in hand with all the state arts agencies and with the 6 regional arts organizations, and really to understand how unique our country is in the system that was designed to ensure that money is flowing from the federal government to all different parts of the country. The National Endowment for the Arts takes great pride that we are funding in every congressional district in the country. We're the largest public funder of the arts in the country, and that's something that even the Mellon Foundation and the Ford Foundation and some of the other big foundations who have a tremendous amount of more assets than we do, they just simply don't have the reach. And when we talked before about why the arts matter, for me, there's nothing better than being on the Hill and being in a conversation with, whether it's a congressperson or a U.S. senator or a staff member, and they want to know, what are you doing for my district, we'll say in Arizona, and you can immediately pull out information and saying, well, actually, we invested more than $400,000 in your congressional district, and here are all the wonderful projects that we're supporting. Not to say that we're the reason those projects are happening, but it's wonderful that we're being able to support it and also lift it up. So it's been an incredible learning experience. It continues to be an incredible learning experience with me, and I'm surrounded by amazing colleagues. We're a small team of about 140 folks, and I miss being with them. Actually, we have not been back in the office, so this is somewhat unusual just to be around people, and I haven't seen Ruby in God knows how long. Certainly over 2 years.
Wow.
My journey to the National Endowment for the Arts, certainly different than most. Born and raised in Chicago, I never thought I would leave Chicago. I started as an unpaid intern 2 days after graduating from the University of Wisconsin to work for then the Department of Cultural Affairs. Now it's Department of Cultural Affairs and Special Events. And my first week on the job, I was given the task. Before Millennium Park existed, it was just a little dinky park across the street. And I had, it still sits in my mind as both endearing and also hilarious. I did a program where aldermen would read children's stories to camp kids. That was my first gig with the Department of Cultural Affairs. And if you're from Chicago, just the idea of half of the aldermen that I worked with are now in prison or have served their prison times. But it was reading in the park with an alderman. And I remember it because it actually was, we talk about belonging. It was this wonderful thing where, kids would come in from all over the city and be right on the, front lawn of Chicago, and have a politician reading them stories. Anyways, that was my very first thing I had to do my first week on the job. I mostly was working in music, and I felt as a kid that grew up in Chicago, going to public schools, I missed the ability to be around all my friends because we all lived in different parts of the city. And I'll say selfishly, I got into music. I have no musical background. Music for me and the arts, but in this case, music was the easiest way to get people to come together. And so I really started working in music, all different kinds of music. And that's really what I did for almost 20 years with the city of Chicago, festivals and concerts, doing things all over the city and neighborhoods. And it kind of ran its course for a whole variety of reasons, which I won't get into, but I felt like I needed a new chapter. I could continue to just be the music presenter, or really try to see a different side of the arts. I applied for this job on a whim, really. And when I told friends that I think I might be moving to DC, everybody was shocked, as was I, that I was going to be moving here. And it's been a wonderful, experience.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that with us. That's great.
Yeah.
Chad, you've also had an interesting trajectory. Why don't you tell
When
us
I
a
told
little bit
friends
about
I was moving to Tucson, people thought I was crazy and wondered why I was doing so. And we'll get to why in a second. But
But at least you lived there before.
So I grew up in Arizona. I think many of you know that. I grew up, spent the first 18 years of my life in Arizona. Went away to college because I thought I wanted to be a dentist. I wanted to be a dentist because my neighbor and uncle were both dentists. They had amazing cars that they drove. They worked 3.5 days a week, and I thought that's exactly how I was going to do it. So I picked my undergraduate school to be a dentist. Where I was lucky is it was a very small liberal arts college, and I was forced to take courses outside of the sciences, and I fell in love with the arts. Much like Mike, it took me many years to consider myself an artist. It was actually probably at the end of my MFA program that I finally was able to stand up and raise my hand and say, yes, I too am an artist. But I'm a huge fan, and that's where my programming experience comes from. That's how I got into this. Music is, as Mike said, what brings people together, and that's where I was, especially in college, hosting concerts in places we weren't supposed to be, and having a lot of people come through, experiencing something new to them and watching them get excited. That actually started when I was in 8th grade, when I started making mixtapes after trying to take a jazz band class. That was my first take at curating, but I was making mixtapes of top 40 music alongside some of the great jazz musicians of the 30s and 40s. And so that was the first way in. I got to the University of Arizona, as Andy mentioned, after spending some time both in Pennsylvania and Connecticut at the International Festival of Arts and Ideas. And coming back to Arizona was hard. Many of you know where UA Presents was 25 years ago and where it was 3 years ago, and it looked a lot different. And it was also something that I was very excited to bring back, and knowing that I personally believe, and being able to spend so much time in the academy doing this kind of work, is that not only do we train the next dentists, doctors, lawyers, business people, but we should also be training the next culture goers. And that was I see that as my role as being a member of this university, is how do we get people to support the arts, live the arts, and have that in our heart. And then hopefully we can also train those next arts leaders that we have some work to do too. And so fortunately, and a lot of you have heard this, the strategic plan was in good draft form when I had been recruited for this job. And so I read this draft of the strategic plan, and I was quite surprised that not only was Pillar 3 there, but also throughout the plan I could read about arts and culture and see that embedded. And then I was also around the same time that Andy was named the Vice President of the Arts. And so I thought, Dr. Robbins, you were really taking this seriously. And maybe this is someplace that I should try out. And it wasn't until I could tell that to colleagues that they thought, okay, I wasn't going there to have my career die, or coming here to have my career die. And I'm very pleased in the work that we've been able to do over the last 2 years to show our friends and colleagues that nothing's dying. In fact, we are moving this university and arts and culture programming and Southern Arizona forward with the kind of work that we can do. As Andy read the description for Arizona Arts Live, or the mission and our purpose earlier, it's to make Southern Arizona our stage, to bring all of you the greatest work that we possibly can, but also take the great work that's being made in Southern Arizona to the world, and really looking at how we do that. I'm very pleased to say that this year alone, the artists that we have coming in from all around the world, all of them are spending time with us in Tucson. They're not coming in for a one-night engagement and flying back out or getting back on that bus immediately, but they're spending days, some of them weeks, with us in town, working hopefully in your offices with your students, throughout the communities, really sharing what it means to be an artist, what it means to be an art maker, and what it means to come together around this work. And so that's where we are with Arizona Arts Live and how I got here today.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Chad. I have a follow-up question for you, Chad. You've worked both in kind of nonprofit programming world and also in the university programming presenting world. How are those things similar and different in your experience doing that work? That might be interesting to this audience to hear about.
Yeah, that's a good question, because I've never really seen them as different.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think when we look at the work that we do, whether it be creating a 16-day International Arts Festival or programming over the course of an academic year or even a calendar year, maybe the difference is just the compression. You do 400 things in 2 weeks, or you do them over the course of a year. It's knowing your audience. That's the kind of work we do. So whether it be for a nonprofit arts organization or for a university, where our primary audience should be those 18 to 24-year-olds on campus, and then we reach out further. There's more similarities than differences, I'd say.
Yeah.
Obviously, universities have tremendous resources that we're able to tap into.
Right.
Ruby's shaking her head yes.
Please say resources.
But I will also say that the way that Arizona Arts Live is currently structured, yes, we have the support of the university, and we're lucky to have the university, but the financial resources that Arizona Arts sees coming in from the university are much different than a lot of our colleagues at other universities, where they're seeing 30 to 70% of their budget coming from the university, and someday we're going to get there.
If I could just add,
sure,
you
please,
asked the
jump in.
difference,
Yeah.
A friend of mine once said the difference between a season and a festival is really just sleep, for both the people working on it and also the audience.
That's right, exactly.
It really just boils down to
I
sleep.
like that. Yeah.
And I'm sure some people in the audience here would agree.
Ruby, I have a follow-up question for you about your work. I touched on this earlier, and you touched on it also, but I'd love to hear more about this preparedness and emergency response work and how that relates to the arts, because it's such an interesting topic that I think we now know we need to be thinking about much more than we used to think about. But what does that consist of, and how are you doing it?
Oh, yeah. So disaster preparedness really encompasses this idea of preparedness, prevention, response, and recovery. And you go through this life cycle. And folks that are more prone to experience natural disaster on a community scale tend to be the ones that are more adept or more informed. But when I first came to the work, it was around, I had sat on a steering committee with the American Red Cross, and in listening to some of their fire prevention trainings and education, I was like, I've got artists in these dinky studios with little ventilation, no exit strategy, like, I don't want them to die. So that's kind of where it started, right? Like, I didn't want to hear, and then, horrendous, you hear ghost ship happen, and that was like, ages later after then, I'm like, that's why we have to do this work, one of the reasons why. So I started doing workshops, and as part of the workshops, I was giving away these little capsules that are, in case of a fire, it's water, a whistle, a mask, and then just kind of prevention tips, not even related. And as I started to just get more familiar, get more education, understand that the arts play a role because we're a resource. We have networks, we have facilities, we have assets, right? There's people that can be mobilized. But then you also think about the things that the arts have to prepare for, right? You've got collections that need to be maintained, organized, preserved. You've got your own records that you have to be thoughtful about. You have the people, right? If something happens and you are an education forward arts organization, you've got to mobilize a communication plan. You've got to, be able to evacuate. So there's all of these like kind of basic things that everybody should know about disaster. But then there's the stuff that's really specific to the arts. And over the years, I was able to get connected with other folks that kind of do this work. So it really feels like it's this very obvious underground network. And there's a group called the National Coalition for Arts Preparedness and Emergency Response. It's a group of organizations that have a large service footprint, whether we're national in scope or more regional in scope. And it's a combination of organizations like mine that support both organizations and artists, or organizations that support artists, or organizations that support organizational structure. So you've got Surf Plus, which focuses on craft artists. You've got folks like NEFA and the Joan Mitchell Foundation, like several just kind of these groups. South Arts is another one. And we've all been sitting down and really trying to address, one, awareness of this as a practice and a function and a need for both individual artists and organizations, right? How do you build your studio in a way that allows you for quick evacuation? How do you build your studio in a way that allows you to archive your work? And a lot of these things, how do we share resources? How do we share communication networks? And then getting past the definition, very traditional idea that disaster equals hurricane, tornado, fire, earthquake, depending on where you live in the country. Because disaster also includes civil unrest. And so we were really grappling with how do we support all of the social justice movement, the uprisings, the protests. What does that mean? Where should arts organizations be in this conversation in terms of response and support, and not just activation? And then also, just kind of thinking about the man-made or human-driven disasters when we're thinking about, school shootings. You're thinking about, attacks or, insurgency. Like, there's just a lot to it that people don't connect. And if you can connect it, then there's an infrastructure around it that can actually help support processing, support access to resources, support building of the infrastructure, which is even still an element of what communities need to be thinking about. And so we've done a lot of work around trying to help individuals, organizations, and communities understand, one, how to build the infrastructure to support the arts community, and two, how to knit themselves into the broader response, right? So every city has a disaster response, and there's, really interesting, like, role play days where people practice, if somebody crashes at the airport, what's going to happen? And the arts aren't always in that conversation. So we've kind of been trying to steward that along as well. In the pandemic, it's just kind of blown everything out of the water in terms of what we know, what we are thinking about, and it's extended this conversation. And I think it's really interesting too when you think about like what we are used to talking about. We don't talk about kind of end of life for organizations, right? That like we're really good at getting people excited, very entrepreneurial. Yeah. We can support you getting it started up and kicked out, but then you're on your own. And when you have to close the doors, there's virtually no resources to help you steward through that. And we don't talk about that at the beginning, that like maybe it's okay to have an end of cycle idea. And in these moments where organizations are closing unexpectedly, what happens to their assets? What happens to their archives? What happens to their institutional history? Where does it go? We've heard, I've been told of an organization that closed its door and just walked away. And all of that inventory, they were a performing arts organization, was lost. Yeah. All of their records were lost because they didn't know to let anybody know that they were doing that. And there were people now we're like, okay, well, now what do we do? And so now we've got through the NCAPER for short, ncaper.org, There's a whole toolkit and a guide and trainings that are being produced around navigating transition like this. So, we're trying to embed that more intentionally so that it's not an afterthought or a response. It's part of the preventative measures.
Yeah, it sounds like really important work, and thank you for leading it and being involved in it.
It's a village.
Yeah, of course it is. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah.
But it's been really great work that we've organized as a body. So thank you.
Sure. Michael, one question I had for you in reading your biography is the international dimensions of the National Endowment for the Arts, which isn't something that intuitively occurred to me. I mean, what does that entail?
Sure, and I just want to, Ruby gave such a great explanation of all that work, and nailed all the acronyms, because I can never remember what NCAPER fully stands for, but South Arts, which is one of our regional arts organizations, and NCAPER just put out a really wonderful guide, and if you go to ncaper.org, there's a wonderful new resource on there, navigating all the things that Ruby was talking about, because as we all know, there's way more disasters each year than there used to be, and it's really important work. So thanks for sharing, Ruby. So when I started at the National Endowment for the Arts, my predecessor Penny Ojeda was the head of the international office. It sat in the chairman's office, and when she retired, that office kind of seemed to go with the flow of what the chairman was interested in. I pulled it out of the chairman's office, and now it sits within the disciplines. And we're a team of basically one and a half. My colleague Guillermo Ochoa and I run the international agency, international activities for the agency. The State Department does a majority of this work, 99% of this work. And it's really out of the Bureau of Education and Cultural Affairs, which everything in DC is an acronym, so people just call it ECA, but it's the Bureau of Education and Cultural Affairs. A lot of ours is connectivity. A lot of ours is making sure that our office is engaged with the State Department, with different agencies focused on international work. We do have some very tangible international programs, and many run through our regional arts organizations. So for instance, and I'm not going to run through all of them, but we work very closely with the Mid-Atlantic Arts Foundation, and one program, U.S. Artists International, which is the only public funding platform that allows artists from the United States to apply for funding to perform at festivals and conferences around the world. That's something that's existed for 15 plus years, and that's a collaboration between us and the Mid-Atlantic Arts Foundation. And that's sadly something that the federal government really doesn't have outside of our agency. The State Department has way more resources, but it's not an application-driven process. They have programs called Arts Envoy that you need to be selected for. I could go on and on. We run with the Japan-U.S. Friendship Commission, we run a 4-decade-long artist residency program in Japan. We send 5 artists every year to Japan for a residency program. There are a bunch of different activities, but I will give one plug. The National Endowment for the Arts is the official member for the IFACA network, which is the International Federation of Arts Councils and Culture Agencies. They produce a number of different global events. There's a World Arts Summit every 2 years, and for the last 3 years, they've been doing regional art summits. And so there's an America's Cultural Summit that was first held in Ottawa in 2018, in 2019 in Buenos Aires, and then we were supposed to host it in person in 2020. Obviously, didn't happen. So we're going to be hosting the America's Cultural Summit virtually online in November, and it'll be 4 kind of half days of all kinds of really interesting discussion that involve all the member countries, the 15 member countries of the Americas. So
interesting.
Yeah.
Thanks. That sounds like interesting work I didn't know about. those dimensions of the
Yeah, I mean,
National Activities.
there's more, but
Yeah.
we can only handle so much as a small team.
Right.
Most important is that we're somewhat involved with all the activities of the State Department, and for another time I could share
That'd
more.
be great. Yeah. So I want to shift topics a little bit to, I think, something that'll be interesting for this audience, and that is, Chad, something you alluded to, which is developing future leaders. And of course, our core business is, as I always like to say, student success, and this is true in the arts as it is in every other field and discipline. And so, thinking not so much about the great work we do training practitioners, but more about kind of the arts leadership side. We have a small arts administration minor. We're interested in growing it, thinking about the future. And so, I'd be curious to hear what advice you'd have for us as we look to the future, and what do we need to be thinking about as we train sort of in that arts administration program future leaders. What do you see as, from your own experiences, as trends to be aware of, or issues to make sure we're addressing? Ruby, I know, for example, that the work you described, disaster preparedness, is work you're also doing, I think, with Drexel. Is that with some of their programs? So what do you see currently on the horizon in terms of what we need to be thinking about as we prepare future arts leaders?
Is it okay if I go first?
I mean,
She's looking at you.
I've thought about this a lot because I stumbled into my career as an unpaid intern at the Department of Cultural Affairs, and it wasn't until my third or fourth year there that I was like, I kind of like this.
Yeah.
I want to do this.
Right.
And so I went back to school at night to Columbia College in Chicago to get my master's in performing arts management. And the program has gotten a lot better there. I will say that what I enjoyed the most was the camaraderie and the cohort and the learning from my classmates. I felt like the core courses were not necessarily instructive to real world scenarios. And if I could dial it back, or if I had advice, at least for them, and I think things have changed, is there needs to be a dose of reality. There needs to be the ability to understand what's happening in the real world in real time. And I feel like there's only so much classwork you can do when you want to prepare to be working in the not-for-profit arts world. I feel like there's more to be gained by actually working in it. And I feel like the internships and the ability to actually be integrated into, whether it's working as Chad's assistant, or working at a small not-for-profit that produces dance, or working, anything. I feel like that's incredibly important. The other thing I wanted to say, and I mentioned this to you before, is this group of people that are currently in school should be also thinking about, how do we change the world that we're in? And I've been, and stop me if you don't want me to go on this tangent, but I've been thinking a lot these past couple of years about the not-for-profit system. And it was really created, I think, around 1970 with the change in the tax code. And there's, I think, 29 501c somethings. There's 501c. It's a system that really needs to be reanalyzed, and it's a system that isn't working for everyone. And this is somebody who works for the federal government, that we only fund 501c3s or 501c something organizations.
Yeah.
But I feel like my advice, at least for folks that are in arts administration programs, this could be a really wonderful thing to start to ideate and brainstorm on, is how can the system be more equitable for the artist communities in the future.
Yeah.
You know, you asked about the international program, and Guillemar and I meet, we used to at least once or twice a month, the IVLP program, which is run by the State Department, the International Visitors Leadership Program. They bring in people from all over the world, and we usually get to meet with them, and they want to know about our system. How does, you know, the art system work in the United States? And everyone's fascinated with our system, not just the state arts agencies and regional arts organizations, but also how not-for-profits work. Also, everyone's fascinated with private philanthropy. And the more we talk about it, the more I'm not convinced that it's the best system. Anyways, it's a long way of saying that I feel like students should also be thinking about what is it that could change to make the arts ecosystem more equitable for everybody.
Yes, the possibility of reinvention in
Yeah.
a pretty fundamental way. Yeah. Thanks, Michael. Ruby, you also mentioned that you came into your current work in a roundabout way. I don't know if you were designing an arts administration program, where would you start? What would be the principles that would guide you as?
One, I wouldn't, but neither here nor there.
Yeah.
So the thing that I think I want to bring forward in consideration is, one, every university, every college lives in a community, and every community has practitioners.
Mm-hmm.
And so invite the practitioners to contribute to your curriculum design, right? Like, you want to know what trends? Ask the people that are doing the actual work, and then have that inform how you move. I think for me, you know, Michelle and I were talking, and in conversation with Dr. Bria Heidelberg, who heads the Westfall College at Drexel, is how we ended up kind of crafting and creating this disaster preparedness course. Because we were talking about what's needed right now, what's missing in the curriculum, and how do we start embedding. And so I think a lot in the years or decades now that I've been designing professional development curriculum, it's what's the spectrum, and what information do I embed how far back in order to get folks to do the best work they can when they're like where I'm at. And some of that means that we have to start thinking about higher education, kind of pre-entry. What's the system for pre-entry? So disaster preparedness is a practice that very few people understand as a practice. So if we work with universities to embed that into the curriculum, that already gets us one step forward, because that person in 5 years when they're in a job will be like, do we have a disaster plan? If nothing else, to set themselves apart from any, the next candidate or the next, the other colleague, or to show that they've got, this kind of comprehensive. The other thing that I think about too is that as I've been working around equity issues, it isn't enough to train people on implicit bias. It isn't enough to train people and inform people on systemic inequity and the underpinning of supremacist culture that's pervasive in our society. It isn't enough. And that's not really my job. My job is to teach everybody in the field who's working equity forward and equity centered practice. Because if that's the only access you have, that's the only information you have access to, then you're already going to be pushing at improvement. And so what happens if universities and colleges re-examine their curriculum development and design from an equity forward, equity centered practice? So you're already teaching folks out of the gate the better way to do the work, even if they're still processing all of the rest of the things around it, right? I don't necessarily feel like I have to have somebody who fully grasps the idea of how implicit bias colors and pushes and informs and agitates all of these decisions that we're making. If I can give them a foundation to work from, that they understand that, oh, this is how you do community engagement. This is how you do, equitable design. And this is how you break down barriers. And this is how if we can teach them that, then that can couple and pair. And then eventually they can do that work on their own. But if we're just pushing at the one thing, the other thing is never going to change, because we don't give people the mechanism, the construction that they need, the formatting, the templates, like the stuff that people need in order to be able to do the work, in order for us to be able to do it consistently.
Yeah. We mentioned Michelle Herzog is here, who's director of this program, and Michelle, I'm looking forward to working with you, and many others on
A lot of
thinking.
pressure.
Yeah,
A lot of pressure.
You're taking notes, right? I have I have lots of questions, but I'm gonna ask one final question so that we can then open it up. And I'm sure this rich conversation has triggered for a lot of people thoughts and ideas that they'd like to share or questions they'd like to ask. But the question I'd like to end on is what are you optimistic about? And end with a general question as we started with one. And I think I will put Chad on the spot for this since he didn't have to answer the arts admin question. I'm sure you have a lot of ideas on that, but just in the interest of kind of wrapping things up, I thought I'll hear those thoughts at sometime soon.
You will. I'm optimistic about where we live in Southern Arizona and what we are able to be doing, both as a university and Arizona Arts Live to reach our communities in ways that we haven't in years past. And a lot of that goes back to what Andy mentioned early on is being grounded in our sense of place. So that's what I'm optimistic about.
We going in order?
Sure.
I'm optimistic about a lot of things. I'm optimistic, at least centered around my work and my agency, that, as I said before, the dial is going in the right direction, and that the arts are really being seen as a way of building, building part of the community development, that it's not just seen as the arts are a nice thing, but they're actually an essential part of communities across the country. This administration clearly gets that. And I've been super excited in my first 6 months or now it's 9 months in this administration, that there are conversations happening with agencies, federal agencies, that never happened before. I find myself in conversations with the USDA, with the Department of Education, with HUD, with so many different federal agencies. In disaster work, my colleague Andy Mathis is in, weekly meetings at FEMA, where these weren't happening before. So I feel like the arts are being more understood as an essential part of communities, and that makes me
that is encouraging.
Really optimistic.
Great.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks. How about you, Ruby? What are you optimistic about? You seem like an optimistic person.
No, yeah, I think the thing that I've really hung on to in this moment, and with so much change and so much uncertainty, is that at the core of who the arts are is this deepness of creativity. And in that creativity, I've held an excitement for what's possible and what we're going to be capable of doing and able and open to doing. You hear a lot about, this arts organization did this type of presentation. They've never done it that way before. And there's very few examples across the country when you think about how many communities exist across the country and very few other people have thought of it this way. Like, that's exciting. And that really gets me energized that even though this is really dire, the ingenuity and the agility that we continue to display in it as a sector, but also as community, right? That I think that's what's really got me so optimistic that we're gonna be fine. We're gonna be different, and that's gonna be okay.
Yeah, great. So I think we have a few minutes to open things up for questions or comments. I think we have a microphone too, which Brian Cunningham is going to steward.
Well, thank you. First, I'd like to thank the university for all the discussions this week and for this one, which has been very enthusiastic and forward-looking. My name is Andre Goodfriend. I was a graduate of the university in 1979 and working for the State Department now, not with ECA, but as a diplomat. And the discussion in some ways started with where we are now post-pandemic, the hybrid environment, and trying to get back to an in-person environment, or seeing what a hybrid would be like in the future, and the challenge, though, that leads to with monetization and ensuring that artists are paid for what they do. And the discussion then seemed to end, or close to the end, with the need to look at new forms of funding. And how do we, it's sort of a move away from the traditional funding methods that you mentioned, Michael, that the nonprofit system needed to be looked at. So I'm wondering, given all of the discussion with regards to the future of work, I mean, beyond the Arts Society, the future of work, the future of whether it's a fourth industrial revolution and lifelong learning, and people no longer needing to work in the same way that they had before, that the issue of monetization and doing things with the idea of having money be the token of value is also something that maybe should be rethought. I mean, the artists are not working for a salary generally. They're not doing piecework. They're creating to get a token of value, which may be money. It may be the appreciation of an audience. And it may be that audience in the future won't have the same kind of money to pay. So given all of that, are the arts perhaps an ideal place to look at how we move away from monetization of creative labor to some way that artists are able to live with dignity, with some type of in an environment where they understand the appreciation, but money is not what skews their work.
Who wants to take
for any
that
of
one?
us to answer?
All right, I'll go. One, yes, right? So for me, the world, so there's this whole thing that like to be an artist, you have to make money. And I don't believe in that. I believe to be an artist, you just have to be an artist. Artists choose to make money, and artists choose to live a fruitful and enriched life like everybody else. And if they choose to do that, then there should be a mechanism and an equitable means by which they can earn a living salary in order to have a nice life like anybody else. And so I think for me, it's more about understanding what infrastructure is missing, what common understanding and appreciation, what is the thing that's missing that is preventing being an artist as an actual viable way of living your life, right? That like if you want to pay your bills by being an artist, what's missing for that to happen? Where I think we place more value on trying to figure that out than we do sometimes on just letting people be artists. Like the person who is sewing pot holders and selling them on Etsy is no less an artist than myself, who dabbles in poetry, than my daughter, who is at any given moment making things out of Play-Doh. Like there's a place for all of that in there. And I think it's for me about flattening the prioritization. Every organization is going to have to kind of navigate its own mission and its own understanding and its own place. I think examining business models, yes, but also funding models and where and how money is able to be accessed, right? Right now you have to have a 501c3 or a fiscal sponsor. I don't tell anybody to do those things. Like, don't go there just to get the dollars. Do the thing that's going to make the most sense for you to get to the place that you want to be. And so maybe that's another thing too, like teach people about other models, right? And so it's a whole thing, and it's been artificially constructed, right? Like the art should never have been a nonprofit, because nonprofit by its very nature is supposed to have a finite life cycle. Art is never ending. So even in that, I think there's like a whole lot of stuff, and it's been, I mean, I can say, I think I've been in that conversation 15 years about like funders be open to funding more than just 501c3s. I get that there's problems, but we should be able to figure it out. It's been a while.
Yeah.
I'll just add that there is some movement, and I think San Francisco is maybe one of the first cities that has talked about guaranteed wage income for artists. Yerba Buena Center for the Arts and Deb Cullinan has been instrumental in that conversation. I think there's a couple other places around the country experimenting with that. It's an interesting conversation, and it actually goes back to what I was saying before about the 501c3 system not working for everybody, and it's a very interesting proposition and conversation to have.
Yeah.
I don't have the short answer to it, but
I'll just add, and I know there's some more questions, that it's also up to people like us and university structures like ours to make sure that we don't think that we have to behave only one way to work with all types of people. So evaluating our contracting process, making sure that we are being equitable to artists and arts organizations, knowing that the work that is being shown on our stages or in our galleries is years in the making, and we shouldn't have to wait until it's delivered to pay for it, that we need to be investing in the front side and being forward thinking there, and being equitable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Another question? Yes, please.
Hi there. Oh, yeah, keep my face mask on. Oh, stand. Okay. Too many things.
It's a dance. We're
I'm an artist.
choreographing
I
a
can
piece
only
right
do
now. Thank you.
one thing at a time. So, by the way, I'm a University of Arizona graduate from 1980 something or another. But I also started an art therapy program there. I didn't start it. Sister Jean Kerrigan did back in 1990 or something like that. And one of the reasons why I'm just coincidentally in DC. I live in Tucson. But I have a nephew who just started at the U of A, and I helped raise him here in DC. So I've been giving him little gifts every year to persuade him to go to the U of A, and it worked for 15 years. But one of the reasons why I was really excited about this venture here is that last night I was here and I went to the back, and there is the Civic Discourse group. I don't exactly know their name. But over the years, as an art therapist, one of the things that has interested me most is the effect of the arts on perception. So what I'm kind of interested in, and I'm kind of asking you, but also you wonderful people who are representing the arts, is the science of art, to change the way people see the world. And so I think that one of the things that happens is the arts get siloed in the arts. Mm-hmm. And so I want to ask you, I just had a conversation with somebody right at the beginning here about art therapy and the creative arts therapies. And the NEA has a program that is affiliated with the Army, the Creative Forces, and they're looking at the effect of the arts in healing people. But there's also the effect of the arts in seeing the world differently. And so for the diplomats, this is a way that we can increase our capacity to bridge. And I would love it if the University of Arizona was on the cutting edge of bringing the arts back into every aspect of the way that we navigate the world, the way we come up with solutions, and the science of the mind as being the source that we justify that. So I'm hoping the University of Arizona will actually be partnering across departments and maybe even develop again a creative arts therapies program. Could you answer whether or not that is something?
Sure.
And then maybe the NEA is also, and also your work. I mean, these are all so interrelated. Thank you. It's sort of a vague question.
Thank you so much, first of all, for being here, and secondly, for asking that great question. You're describing exactly what our mission is. And that is to really integrate the arts across the university and think about the role and value the arts can play, really in dialogue with almost every discipline. And in my own personal journey, which I didn't talk about in this context, that's why I am interested in the arts at the kind of university that the University of Arizona is. It's not a standalone arts conservatory, and there's a lot of value in that kind of place, but rather the arts are embedded in a major public research university. And to me, that opens up possibilities that don't exist in other contexts. And so the first thing, when we interview faculty, the first thing I ask them is, why is this context exciting to you? What do you see as the set of relationships and conversations you'd like to be part of across the university? And I'll just say that my experience at the University of Arizona in the 3 years I've been here is that it's a place where those kinds of conversations are not only possible, but they're encouraged and fostered. And so we have an incredible range of dialogues going on across the university, including many with health sciences. And one of the things that excited me about coming to the U of A were the conversations I had with President Robbins as I was interviewing about the connections between arts and health, arts and wellness, arts and medicine. And we're developing and have developed a whole range of curricular and programming and other kinds of partnerships. Chad's played a really important role in many of those. So you're speaking to the vision that we're going to enact and already are enacting. Regarding arts therapy, I'm interested to hear more about this history you described. Maybe we can talk for a minute afterwards. We're in the process of looking at and probably standing up a music therapy program where we see a lot of potential. It's deeply of interest to our faculty, and there's a strong need. And as you know, amazing applications and results through that work. So those are some of my thoughts on the issues you've raised. I don't know if others want to share anything as well.
It sounds, Rebecca?
Yes.
Yeah, it sounds like a ton about what's happening at the NEA. I'll just say that Creative Forces has been a project that has been in the works for, ever since I've been at the NEA, which is 9 years. Actually, Creative Forces is a wonderful partnership between Americans for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Arts, where we just announced another layer of it. But I think the most important accomplishment to date is that the Department of Defense has invested in this, that it's not just coming from the arts people, but the Department of Defense actually truly understands the importance of arts therapy and the healing of both physical and invisible wounds. I've been around the agency long enough to see the program that just existed at NICO at Walter Reed to now it's at 14 bases around the country, and it's a humongous investment. So outside of Creative Forces, I will say that our Office of Research and Analysis, led by Sunil Iyengar, who's a wonderful colleague, they have been doing a ton of really interesting work, not just in research, but in partnerships with NIH, with other federal agencies around music in the brain. There's a partnership with the Kennedy Center that Renee Fleming and other people are involved in. That's an investigation of how the arts, and in this case, music, plays such a role in brain development. So I'm just proud to say I have nothing to do with any of that, but I'm proud to be working alongside folks that are invested in that. And we're also funding, we get hundreds of applications around the country that are in the creative therapy space. So yes, I agree with you 1,000%. Yeah.
I think the only thing I would add, so that is a separate area, but yes, all of the great things that he said around Creative Forces. For me, it's about the arts and, right? So we have, it's a fascinating project that a colleague of mine, Clay Lord, led called the Social Impact Wheel Explorer. And it's a wheel, and there's 30 spokes on the wheel, and it's all arts and other areas. So arts and climate change, arts and health, arts and equity, arts and. And if you go to the wheel and you spin the, like you go around the wheel, you click on a wedge, it'll open up how the arts are being used to address or to activate or animate that particular element. So I think for us, it's also been an opportunity to explore what other strategic partnerships we need to build. So we're looking at other federal agencies that may or may not have integrated or are thinking about integrating the arts into the work that they're doing. So we've been looking at more specifically the USDA around rural activation and support. So it's interesting when you think about, threading the arts through other, college departments or college subjects, but also what does it mean when we thread the arts through the rest of the community? And so, yeah, if you have a second, check out that Social Impact Explorer. It's really interesting. And again, for us, it's just illuminated another area where we have an opportunity to push the conversation, the dialogue, and the practice for the field in order to, again, help knit the arts back in more deeply into the rest of their community.
Yeah. Well, we're at time. And I want to thank the panelists, Ruby, Michael, and Chad, for a really rich and interesting conversation. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. Really, really happy to have had a chance to talk with you. And so please join me in giving them a round of applause. And thanks again to all of you for coming out on this fairly bleak morning. Hopefully it was bright and sunshiny in here, and I'm sure we'll be able to stick around a little bit for informal conversation if people want to continue in that format. So thanks again, everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you very
that was
much.
great, you guys.
And the rain stopped.